I'm not asking the government to reveal all its secrets. Governments have secrets. That's in the nature of the beast. What I am anxious to do is to ensure that Indian citizens' rights are protected in our democracy, in our increasingly eroding democracy.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. The monsoon session of Parliament has been, to say the least, stormy. One of the issues that the opposition has tried to pin the government down on is the Pegasus snooping scandal, which raises difficult questions for the government on privacy, democracy, civil rights, national security, and political accountability. Over the last few months, the government has also been having bitter face-offs with social media companies about freedom of expression. Now, in a strange twist, Twitter has shut out many Congress leaders' handles, including Rahul Gandhi. This shifting landscape of conflict points to a deeper issue. How should we think about technology in a free world? What is the legal framework within which it should function? My guest on the show today, Shashi Tharoor, is one of India's most affable and articulate political leaders, and he's also the chairman of the Parliament Standing Committee. I'll be speaking to him about all of these issues and more. Thank you very much for joining me on the show, Shashi.
Thank you so much, Shoma. It's a pleasure to be with you, as always.
So, Shashi, Parliament sessions are over and no business was conducted, but very important issues were tried to be raised, especially the Pegasus issue. The opposition was pushing for the Prime Minister or the Home Minister to really take on questions. That didn't happen. So let's assume you had the Prime Minister or the Home Minister at the other end of the screen right now. What are the three hard questions you'd pose?
Well, first of all, have you been using Pegasus against domestic surveillance targets? If so, under what provision of law had you done so? Do you consider it ethical to use taxpayers' money to promote the partisan political advantages of the ruling party? Is it appropriate for snooping on journalists, political operatives like Prashant Kishore, political opponents like Rahul Gandhi or Abhishek Banerjee? What exactly is the purpose of this kind of thing? What is the connection between your visit to Israel and your deployment, apparently, of this technology? And if after all of this you deny having used this technology at all, aren't you concerned that some foreign country then, because Pegasus is only sold to governments, that some foreign country's government is busy snooping on your citizens? And if so, what are you going to do about it? What action are you going to take? Then there are other rather serious implications. Once you've got this data, is the data sitting on servers in Israel, in a foreign country? Is the data of the objects, Indian objects of your surveillance, something that foreign intelligence agencies have access to? These are also all rather serious questions. So there's a great deal that needs to be sorted out. I must say that I understand the government's reluctance to discuss these matters. If it was a question purely of national security, if the targets were foreign governments, foreign leaders, and so on, I think the opposition would have understood. But when you find that what seems to be a technology intended to trace or track terrorists, criminals, and serve foreign intelligence purposes being deployed for nakedly political partisan ends, then you can imagine there's going to be a terrific level of anger, as there has been manifested by opposition parties in this session of Parliament.
So absolutely, Shashi, and it's pretty stark that both the IT ministers, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad and the current IT minister, Ashwini Vaishnaw, have both said on record that there was no unauthorized surveillance, which can only mean that there was authorized surveillance. So that clearly points to the involvement of state, either agencies or the government. So are there no laws under which the government would be enjoined to respond to what the opposition has been demanding?
Well, there are. The problem is the laws actually explicitly forbid this. You see, we have two laws under which there can be interception of communications. One is the Telecoms Act, which is really based on the old
1885.
Telegraph Act of 1885. And the other is the IT Act of 2000. Now, the IT Act of 2000 is the one that specifically talks about data and the introduction of viruses, malware, or spyware into computer devices, networks, or resources is explicitly criminalized and punishable by 3 years in prison or fine of up to 5 lakh rupees. So there's no way the government can say that putting Pegasus into an Indian citizen's phone is covered by any law. There is no way they could have authorized this surveillance on paper because there is no law on the basis of which they could have done so. So the problem is, this is clearly, if it has happened, it has been done outside the books. It has probably been financed outside the books as well. I know people have been looking at where the finance for this kind of thing is coming from. And some people have latched on an important spike in the budget of the National Security Council. But the National Security Council's mandate is principally really directed against criminals and terrorists. So we're not sure that that's the body or that's the accounting head under which Pegasus has been deployed, if it has been deployed. But if it has been deployed, there are, I believe, and I can't swear that I've never worked in the security domain in India, I believe there are accounts that are not revealed to Parliament in the budget, secret accounts from which these expenditures might have been undertaken. Now, I'm not asking the government to reveal all its secrets. Governments have secrets. That's in the nature of the beast. What I am anxious to do, however, is to ensure that Indian citizens' rights are protected in our democracy, in our increasingly eroding democracy.
Yeah, so Shashi, I'm going to come back to who the subjects of this surveillance were, but just to stick with the laws for a moment, are you asserting that under no law, current existing laws, that any surveillance can be authorized? Or is it like under the Data Protection Bill, the Act, there's specifics on unity, integrity, security of the nation, not the government, but the nation, that they can intrude into citizens' privacy. So are there any provisions, or are you saying blanket?
So under the Telegraph Act and the IT Act, there are these exceptions given in national security grounds where an authority to intercept communications, to listen, for example, to telephone, tap phones, in other words, is permitted and has to be recorded. There are very specific procedures. There's a Supreme Court order that says how you have to do it. A committee has to be established. The committee has to rule it. There is a review committee. The original committee is headed by the Home Secretary, the review committee by the Cabinet Secretary, and they have to authorize or permit the authorization of this kind of interception. However, under the IT Act, not the Data Protection Bill, because that hasn't been passed yet as a law, but under the IT Act, you have two specific sections, 43 and 66, that forbid implanting viruses, software, malware, spyware into computer devices, resources, or networks. In other words, you can listen into a conversation. You cannot plant a piece of software into somebody else's device. That may seem a precious distinction, but in fact, it's a rather important distinction. So you could have authorized somebody to listen to a conversation on a smartphone. You could not have authorized somebody to plant something that essentially captures the contents of that smartphone for you. That is illegal under the Act. And therefore, even if you could have authorized an interception for national security purposes, security, integrity of the country, etc., you could not have authorized the planting of spyware. So that's the real issue of legality that's before us.
Right. So, I'm again going to come back to the subjects, but the other really issue at stake is that even the security agencies, Shashi, there are different acts which define different agencies as being security agencies. So the IT Act lists 4, the Intelligence Operations Act lists 4, the RTI Act lists 22. So, there's no clarity actually about the alphabet soup that comprises the security apparatus of the state. So, you're the head of the Parliament Committee on Information Technology. So I'm going to come to your specific role in this. But just for audiences listening in, Shashi, in 2019, it was, Citizens Lab first raised the flag that 121 activists and journalists seem to have come under surveillance. Here's a question back for opposition. Why did this not become an explosive issue back in 2019? Why has it taken it 2 years when finally politicians find they themselves were under surveillance?
I get the point.
Citizens' rights.
I get the point. In fact, when this thing happened, my committee actually met to discuss the issue. We had a very serious effort made by the BJP members of the committee to bar discussion. It went all the way to a vote, at the end of which there was a tie as to whether a discussion would take place or not. I used my casting vote to permit discussion to take place. We summoned witnesses who were people who had been notified by the Toronto Citizens Lab that their accounts, their WhatsApp had been compromised and that Pegasus had reached their phones. But we were unable, in all the testimony we got from the three ministries concerned, to get anyone to either confirm or deny that this had happened. And because these activists were engaged in activities which could loosely have had some sort of bearing on national security, because, for example, some of them were involved in the Bhuma Bhima Koregaon matter. There was, at least in theory, a case alleging essentially sedition and unlawful activities and so on. It was a little more of a gray area. Whereas with the present accusations, the present transgressions, you have people who have at no stage in any way been accused of unlawful activities. There is Prashant Kishore conducting an election in the middle of a campaign. There are 40 journalists whose only job is a regular beat going around asking politicians questions. It becomes very difficult to discuss a matter in which you cannot in any way defend tapping the instruments of people against whom, by no stretch of the imagination, could there have been any national security case argued. Now, I'm not suggesting that in the first cases the government ever admitted doing it, they didn't. And I'm not suggesting that they even claimed a national security excuse, they didn't. But I'm saying even that remote possibility would not apply to the people whose names have come up now. And that is why the particular outrage. Also, of course, the scale of this is colossal. Unlike the Toronto Citizens Lab exposure, which was only about a vulnerability in WhatsApp, and as far as I remember, identified a very limited number of people in their roles. I think there was something like 23 or maybe 30 in India, possibly less, and so on. We are talking here about literally hundreds, if not a few thousand people who may have been the targets of Pegasus in 16 different countries. Pegasus itself has clients in 40 countries. So the scale of the expose right now warranted a different level of attention.
Well, Shashi, it seems important to drive home the irony that the NSO itself has claimed that this extremely intrusive spyware was meant to really, uncover terrorists or really people who are undertaking dangerous anti-national activities. And during this entire time when Pegasus has been surveilling or deemed to be surveilling activists, politicians, judicial officers, etc., we've actually had a Chinese intrusion, we've had terror attacks, we've had military intrusions on the border. So clearly it was not being used in the correct way at all, But in this context, Shashi, when opposition has literally stalled Parliament through this entire session, when there was a demand for a joint Parliament committee to look into this, you were reluctant and you wanted it discussed under your standing committee of Parliament. Why did you resist it? Because the JPC would have...
There was no resistance whatsoever. The demand that the opposition parties made, and I might say that I started that demand, was for an independent inquiry by a Supreme Court monitored process. In other words, either a current or a recently retired Supreme Court judge being asked to conduct an inquiry under judicial rules or under the Commission of Inquiry Act. Reason being quite simply that I had already learned from the experience of 2 years earlier that we talked about, how little can be achieved if the bureaucrats we are allowed to summon come and stall. Furthermore, there is this real concern that this kind of inquiry will require much more than any group of politicians is going to be able to accomplish. A judge, for example, can marshal evidence and apply a judicial process to it. A judge can ask volunteers to submit their phones for forensic analysis and order an independent forensic analysis of those phones. Parliamentary committees, whether joint or unjoint, and all our committees are de facto joint anyway, don't have any such powers. So my desire from the start was to ensure the most rigorous and farthest reaching exploration of this or investigation of this potential wrongdoing. And if it is going to be a committee, then we already, you put a joint parliamentary committee on job where the issues involved transcend the responsibilities of one committee. It's not usual that you create a joint parliamentary committee on a subject that's already on the agenda of an existing parliamentary committee. You see what I'm saying? All parliamentary committees include both Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha. The only difference is that GPC is always chaired by the majority party in parliament. So the BJP would chair an inquiry into the BJP, whereas at least right now the IT committee is chaired by an opposition member. So some independence and some objectivity or neutrality might be considered possible. Though obviously my friends in the BJP don't consider that that guarantees anything other than, as they see it, a political vendetta. And I think we are in a position where politicians are perhaps understandably taking a purely political stand.
Yeah, but it was disturbing to see 2 days ago when I think 10 members of your committee didn't show up just to, even though the committee was called. So it's really turning all sort of instruments of parliament into toothless.
Oh, it was slightly worse. They actually showed up, but they refused to sign the register in order to deny us a quorum. Had there been one more person who was not BJP in that room, there would have been a quorum, and then they would have stayed and tried to obstruct the process, I don't doubt. But since they were 10 and the non-BJP members were 9, and you need 10 for a quorum, we had to end up dissolving the meeting. But for good measure, the 3 secretaries who were supposed to testify found last-minute excuses not to attend, which is in fact an act of a breach of privilege of Parliament and an act of contempt of the House. So we're looking at very extreme positions, I'm sorry to say, taken by all of these things.
So this is all really disturbing landscape, Shashi. President Nixon lost his job for much less. Why do you think the grounds have shifted so much that across the world today, governments are being able to weather scandals like this, and there's not enough fire and outrage around it? Why is there no accountability around this level of intrusion on civil liberties?
There's a lot of fire and outrage where I sit and amongst the people I meet and see. There is absolutely no doubt that you talk, for example, to our friends from the Trinamool Congress in Bengal, which was, of course, directly targeted. The fury and rage you hear expressed is truly quite extraordinary. And there's also fury and rage at various levels. I mean, you've seen sedition cases being slapped on people. You've seen journalists being sent to jail on sedition or UAPA charges. You're seeing farmers' laws being passed without consulting farmers. You're seeing bills being bulldozed through Parliament with 5-6 minutes of process and no discussion, and so on and so forth. There's a terrible erosion of our parliamentary democracy. Not showing up for a committee and apparently instructing officials not to attend is also an act of true violence against the processes and principles of parliamentary democracy. It's truly dismaying how far this government is prepared to go, when ultimately democracy should be understood as a set of processes that serve everybody. After all, the BJP used to be in opposition. One day they will be in opposition again, and they may regret the precedents they have set in truly making the exercise of democratic accountability nearly impossible.
So Shashi, typically, nowadays nobody wants to come for a debate. It's usually one-way conversation. So I know that if there was anyone from government or any other party sitting here, they would say that you all have stalled processes in Parliament, not allowed Parliament to function. So it's you all who've actually subverted process. How would you take on that criticism?
Well, look, it was a very simple matter for the government to agree to address Parliament on the subject of Pegasus surveillance, give us whatever statement or explanation they could, and take some questions. They would have had to take a few attacks, but if indeed they have a good story, in other words, if they have not violated the law, they could say so, and that would have been that. What the government chose to do was to stall, in frankly a rather outrageous way, with the result that we find ourselves in a position where the opposition parties felt deeply and sincerely insulted. I mean, I can't put another word on it. They felt it was an insult to them as parliamentarians and to the prerogatives of Parliament for them to be disregarded in this way. Now, if the government had actually had a discussion on Pegasus, let's say a 2-hour, 3-hour discussion maximum, replied to whatever questions were raised as best as they could, that would have diffused the matter. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that at the end of the day, what we would have seen would have been serious discussion on COVID, on vaccine mismanagement and shortage of vaccine supplies, on unemployment, on the question that we are facing today of the economic collapse, the China border, and of course the farm laws, which have agitated so many farmers across northern India in particular. We are looking at a bunch of issues that the opposition came to Parliament anxious to discuss. People forget that Pegasus broke on the first day of Parliament. And that essentially put paid, the government's intransigence on Pegasus put paid to what could have otherwise been a very interesting and serious session. So my answer to those who say that from the government side is, why did you not discuss an issue that is of such momentous concern around the world? And that by discussing, you could have then opened the doors to a much more peaceful conduct of a very important session with key issues on the national table, the national agenda.
What I asked you in the beginning what questions you would have posed to the Prime Minister. What is the response you would give to the Home Minister's assertion that the timing of this investigation or expose is what is more problematic in his eyes than the content of the investigation?
Well, I think the Home Minister has to really ask himself whether he really thinks that journalists from 16 countries who have planned and launched an investigation spanning over several months and who had planned their date of releasing their findings way in advance, before the dates of the monsoon session were known or announced, why could they, and in what way could they possibly have tied their work to the dates of the monsoon session? I think it's very much a kind of frog in the well approach. When you're sitting in the world seems to be the well. And I think for the Home Minister to imply that his monsoon session is the most important thing for everyone else in the world, that they would do something like this tied to India's parliament, I think, sorry to say, betrays an exaggerated sense of self-importance. I think they just picked a date. By coincidence, our government picked the same date for the monsoon session, but this process well precedes even the decision to hold a monsoon session on a particular day.
Speaking as a journalist for my fraternity, Shashi, I would also add to that to say that let's assume that you do time exposes for maximum impact. That's very much within your prerogative to do. The point is, what is being exposed? Is it false? Is it credible? Is it not? Is it good investigation? Is there matter to be discussed? Or is it a frivolous exposes? So
do
I
you
don't
think
the timing of anything matters. The point is what's the content?
Exactly. I mean, do you think it's frivolous when you think that what we're talking about is a government potentially, if it is proven that they have done this is a government that has potentially misused taxpayers' money for partisan purposes, violated civil liberties, explicitly broken the law by introducing spyware, completely shattered the privacy of dozens, if not more, of Indian citizens, and apparently completely ridden roughshod over the principles of political democracy in this country, all for very small, petty, narrow political advantage. Now, you tell me if this is frivolous or not. I don't think it's frivolous. I think if it's true, it's incredibly serious. If it's not true, it's even worse, because it means that we have got such a large set of loopholes in our security protections that some foreign country and agency is cheerfully listening to your conversation with me, Prashant Kishore's conversation with Mamata Banerjee, Rahul Gandhi's conversations with his friends and his colleagues. It really is outrageous.
So before we move to the other issues around technology and democracy, Shashi, there's just one point I'd like you to emphasize. You said earlier that if at all surveillance or even interception is allowed to tap into people's phones, you have to give reasons why people seem suspect to you. I think today people feel that because we're online and we've given our phone numbers to banking companies and to Swiggy and to everyone that, privacy doesn't matter. But I think it's important to emphasize that there has to be a reason why people can intercept your conversation. It can't
Look, if one item of Pegasus is $7 million, as the media tells us it is, I don't think Swiggy is buying it to listen to they may have your number, but I don't think they're going to spend $7 million to listen to what you're up to on your phone. It's only governments with large amounts of taxpayers' money available that are able to spend and deploy that kind of money. It's as simple as that. And I'll be very honest with you and say that the balance of probabilities that even a foreign government or a foreign intelligence agency would be tapping the phones of 40 Indian journalists and a political operative in a West Bengal state election, the balance of probabilities makes that seem very unlikely. This looks like a set of targets of interest to the ruling party. And perhaps the ruling party has spent its own money and it's not the government that's done it. I don't know. But the truth is that it seems more and more likely, given that Pegasus itself claims they only sell to governments, it seems more and more likely that the government appears to have misused taxpayers' money for such a purpose. And I think we need a judicial inquiry to find out if they've done so. It's as simple as that.
So what are next steps, Shashi, on this issue? Because Parliament is over. Of course, some petitioners have gone to the Supreme Court and put in a petition there. But the Supreme Court posed a question as to why is there no FIR? Now, the West Bengal government has also instituted an inquiry, and they've said they would like information from the public. But there's a very piquant situation here, which is that actually only the government can provide information because, but in response to the Supreme Court question about why political parties have not filed an FIR on this, what would you say?
Well, I think, frankly, since I have no indication that my phone has been tapped, I can't file an FIR. But for those who know their phones have been compromised, my guess is they feel that what is the point of complaining to the people you suspect have done it to you? If you think that the Home Ministry of India is culpable in going after your phone, why would you go to a police that is answerable to the Home Ministry and ask them to file an FIR? And then they may in turn say, in that case, give us your phone as evidence. And you're actually presenting almost as a gift something that the government was after in the first place. That may be why they've hesitated. I don't know. I've not asked.
Right. So, this brings us to all the other issues around technology and democracy. Shashi, over these last few months, we've seen really high-profile, high-octane battles between the government and social media companies like Twitter and WhatsApp, Facebook, and the frame of reference keeps shifting, So let's start with Twitter and the government, which was, the latest one, where the government asked Twitter to take down some accounts. In the past, the government has been seen to be close to these companies, but now they were threatening arrest, and Twitter was holding on to what it said was the constitutional principles of India and said that the government was violating the freedom of expression rights of Indian citizens. Where do you, as the head of a Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology, stand on this issue?
Look, let me say, first of all, I really don't speak as the chairman of the committee, because that's something where, in principle, a chairman gives voice to the collective wisdom of the committee, and there is neither been an official discussion on the subject, nor has there been, I'm sorry to say, any sort of authorized agreement. When we do a report to Parliament on any of these issues, then I can speak to that report. But before that, I'm afraid I'll take off that hat and just speak to you as a member of Parliament who happens to be interested in these issues. I would say that we are looking at a very interesting moment, an unprecedented moment in the entire evolution of public discourse. Social media is a medium. It's something which didn't exist 10 years ago in its present form. It is now essentially reinventing much of what we understand about public communications, about the way in which people are able to express opinions. Freedom of expression, for example, in the past was between you and your government. Either the government disallowed freedom of expression, stifled it, or allowed it, and you expressed your views, but you were mediated through a newspaper whose editor did his fact-checking and so on, and then published you or whatever. Now, suddenly, everybody can jump right on social media. There is no editor, no copy editing, no fact-checking, nothing. They go right in, they post what they have to say. It's out there. If somebody from a social media company takes it down, they're accused of stifling freedom of expression. If they don't take it down, they're accused of enabling a platform that can be misused to promote hatred, disaffection, and so on. If a government then cracks down on the company, that's an indirect way of having an effect on freedom of expression. These are very complicated new issues that literally have not been known in human civilization 10 years ago. So we really have to work our way through all of this. And to my mind, I tend to err on the liberal side, as it were, of all these issues. I like to see myself trying to ensure that as far as possible, people are allowed to express their views in as many different ways with as little interference as permissible. Now, where we stand today is that we are in the middle, for example, of a crisis involving Rahul Gandhi's and Congress Party supporters' accounts being locked for issuing a tweet which is deemed to be a violation of Indian law as well as of Twitter policy. Who do you blame? On the one hand, Twitter says, if we don't follow Indian law when we're operating in India, you attack us, saying, who are you to bring Californian sensibilities to India? in India follow Indian law, and we're following Indian law. You cannot tweet a particular picture, therefore you have to take it down. On the other hand, you have people saying, but Twitter has been, shall we say, intimidated by the ruling party into singling out people from the principal opposition party and stifling their voices. These are all questions that create endless and unceasing debate, and on which, frankly, there will be no real consensus. But certainly not within my committee, because my committee obviously has a number of political voices that have their own perspectives.
But Shashi, in fact, this actually points to the crisis of democracy and our current sort of, just scale of political action and discourse, because when we were setting up the country, there were much more thorny issues which actually got thought through and laws were framed. Right now, I think it's not difficult to frame a sort of frame of reference within which tweets can be asked to be taken down or not, which can be seen to be fair by all players. Like, for instance, right now, it's very evident that the person who tweets is not even allowed to put out a defense of what they tweeted, what their content was, what is the evidence for it. It's all very unilateral, it's very whimsical one way or the other. So actually, more than just reacting to every situation, there should be an attempt by all legislators to actually take on these issues and frame a law. Now, here's where I have a question for you, Shashi, in your party, that today when this government is accused of digital authoritarianism, the seed law that they use is the IT Act of 2000, where 69A actually had to be struck down because of the illiberalism in it, as well as how badly that particular clause was framed. What do you have to say about the Congress's own impulse on technology and freedom and democracy?
Well, look, I had nothing to do with that, so I'm not defending anybody. I would say that the Congress may have been, in this particular instance, guilty of not particularly careful drafting of the provision. Their intentions were the best. And I think that as far as the court judgment is concerned, I concur with it. I think the court did the right thing in the Shreya Singhal case in striking that down. And as far as I'm concerned, you can never be too pro-liberal expression and freedom of expression in a country like India, where it's so difficult to fight for your space to be heard, where the voiceless need a voice, whether it's on social media, whether it's on print, or whether it's simply standing on the street and being allowed to speak. We must limit as much as possible the power of government, authorities, legal systems, and police to prevent people from expressing their opinions. Otherwise, our claims to democratic pride, I think, become absolutely questionable. Now, when you talk about things like, does the Congress blame itself, or is the Congress only take a particular stand when it's in opposition? My answer is it's long been true that where you stand depends on where you sit, and that some of the positions the BJP took in opposition are the opposite of the positions they're taking now in government, and vice versa for the Congress. And all I will say is it's a pity. I mean, I'd like to think, for example, that I've been consistent in my principles, whether I've been in government or in opposition or outside both. The truth is that as far as politics is concerned, in my view, it's got to be about these principles. You've got to have a clear idea of what kind of social environment, political environment you want to create, what kind of India you want to build. And I believe in a democratic India with free expression available to all. And in these circumstances, that's the side that I find myself on consistently. So I'm glad 69A isn't there. I have, in fact, urged, I don't think this is a secret, I've urged in the committee that the IT Act be reviewed and brought up to date because of all the provisions and the development since then. Remember, the IT Act was written before Facebook existed, Twitter existed, before Google had grown to its present size, before any of these modern apps from Instagram to Clubhouse to God knows what else existed. There's now a whole new world out there that the IT Act had not even conceived of. And I think it's good to just write a whole new IT Act one generation after the original. And it's certainly overdue to scrap the Telegraph Act of 1885 and to write a new Telecoms Act that will stand the test of time in 2085.
So, Shashi, just to start the beginnings of that conversation here, just in this confusion that reigns right now, a few months prior to the government's face-off with Twitter, it was accused of being very close to Facebook, and Anki Das, their policy head, was in fact, she had to go because there was so much of allegation around that. And the government has used Twitter, the BJP has used Twitter a lot in the past. So like I said, the ground keeps shifting about, they also took away the blue tick from Mr. Venkaiah Naidu and from Mr. Mohan Bhagwat. And so, it's like a cannon that's going in all directions. So let's just lay out some baby steps at this moment. What are the very obvious things that you see that can be done? I can start with one, which is that if Rahul Gandhi has tweeted one tweet which doesn't sit with the laws of the country, then that particular tweet can be taken down. I don't see why his account has to be locked, So, and there should be a basic provision where people can defend their tweets. So,
well, let me say that I've urged Twitter to rethink their policy, but their answer at the moment is their policy is what it is and has been for some time, and it's a worldwide policy, and therefore they're not moved by any particular case in one particular country to redo it. But I did say that that as far as they're concerned, it's in their interest to avoid a situation where their very first reaction to a violation, in most cases, by the way, an inadvertent violation, is something as overwhelming as locking an account. It happened to me and to Ravi Shankar Prasad when we inadvertently committed copyright violations by putting on our tweets videos received on the internet, which apparently were copyright, and neither the original person who sent the video nor we knew it was copyright. We put it out there. They blocked the account. We were able to unblock it by deleting that particular tweet. But the question is, why go for such a blunderbuss approach? Why not you do the job of upholding the law? If you get a complaint, you blur a photo or you block the sound on a video, and then you send a warning notice to the user saying, we've had to do this, please be careful in future. This locking of an account is an incredibly intrusive and offensive thing to do, and I've told Twitter that. I would agree with you. They should not have locked the accounts of these 5,000 Congress supporters who've all been guilty of retweeting the same image. And I think it's unfortunate they've done that. It's also true, however, that they have a complaint from the, I think the National Commission for Child Welfare, which is a government body, and they felt obliged nationally to work in the framework of the law. So they're not totally in the wrong in that they are observing the letter of the law, but the letter of the law simply required them to prevent that photo from going around. It did not oblige them to lock the account. That's their policy, and they ought to rethink that policy.
So, these are complex issues and it'll take us too long to unravel all of it. But, just on the issue of the government's new IT Amendment Act, which is the Intermediary Act, where they have made Facebook, Twitter, all the social media platforms, Instagram, responsible for all the content that's put on their platform. Now that actually turns them into publishers. And it also has made the digital publishers, the new digital born news media have different rules than all the rest of the media, news media. So what is your position on that, Shashi? Should the intermediaries be responsible, or should individual people who put out content be responsible for their content?
So you're putting me in a slightly awkward position, but this is an issue that is still being debated within the committee. As an individual, I would say that one is responsible for what one says. But the entire question as to whether these social media companies are purely intermediaries, that is, they're like postmen who take your mail and deliver it to somebody else, that question has already moved on through such decisions as Twitter, for example, suspending the account of Donald Trump. If Twitter is independently deciding that what Trump has done is hate speech, and therefore he should not be on their platform, then that no postman can tell you you're writing rude letters, I won't deliver your letters. So they've already gone beyond being a pure postman, a pure intermediary. And this is why the issue is fairly complicated. It's not pure black and white, because we are seeing ourselves being in a position where a company like Twitter, on the one hand, says, if we don't take down these tweets, we are accused of enabling hatred. We are accused of enabling inflammatory postings. If we do take it down, we're accused of interfering as publishers. We can't win. But we are in a new social media world where new rules have to be devised. They are not really postmen. In any case, your post comes in a sealed envelope. If this is a public platform, other people can read it. It can incite misbehavior and violations of law. So what are you? Are you some sort of a gigantic worldwide notice board? And if so, what are the obligations of a notice board under the old laws that can be applied to the new ones? All of these things have to be sorted out, Shoma. I'm sorry there are more questions than answers, available, but you're raising through your questions an awareness of the fact that we are really in uncharted territory, and there have to be new roles and new roads created and new signposts erected, which we are in the process of doing through each of these incidents and crises.
And that brings me to the final quick component of this conversation, Shashi, which is the whole financial implications, because the truth of the matter also is that these companies have become gigantic. They have huge financial power. They're actually, guardrailing who can be heard, who can't, who comes up on the algorithm, who gets to be heard more. And there's big money driving all of that as well. So now, again, that's the other fight that has been exploding across countries, from Australia to India to, France and elsewhere in Europe and in America, where they're even developing antitrust legislation against the big tech companies. So in India also, there's been a move to make these tech companies pay publishers for using their content. Very quickly, just first thoughts on that. What do you think is the fair way? And then again, only big gets to, the biggest companies get the rewards, So that whole idea of an egalitarian net is already breaking down. So what do you think about that?
No, please forgive me. I'm not going to pronounce myself on this, because this is genuinely an issue that requires further consultation and discussion with stakeholders. And as long as I'm chairman of the IT committee, it would be inappropriate for me to compromise that discussion by expressing a view, especially a conclusive view, too early in the process. Let me say, we have discussed a number of important issues and questions. These questions point to the scale of the challenge. Let me try and get stakeholders involved in trying to come up with a sensible approach. If, for example, the IT Act is to be revised, these are questions that will be done in that. The intermediary guidelines are themselves up for discussion, and I believe some have gone to court on some aspects of those guidelines. So there's also a judicial process involved. Let's not try and think that these are matters that lend themselves to quick and glib solutions. There aren't. And whatever we decide will have an impact on large numbers, in fact, millions of people, for some time to come. So let's do this a little thoughtfully. I don't mean to be, I never duck questions. I sort of walk in like a fool where angels fear to tread. But in this particular instance, I think it's wise that we leave some of these important uncharted areas for a process of charting that remains to be done.
So then let me pose the last question to you, which is that, like you said, this is virgin territory, needs completely new thought, new legislative frameworks, but perhaps international legislative frameworks, not just domestic frameworks, because these are trans-border issues as well. And you're getting those benefits of having conversations trans-border. So they are complex issues, Shashi, but at least when the Constitution of India was framed, there was a very liberal set of leaders across party lines, even those who wildly disagreed with each other, who were framing the framework of our country. Today, do you feel comfortable that the legislations that will be discussed and framed around these are being propelled by a liberal impulse or by an illiberal impulse?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that I have been very concerned for some time that the India to which I returned after a long career at the UN is very different from the India that has been degenerating in the last 7 years. And I say this particularly in the context of democracy, civil liberties, and freedom of expression, all of which are simply not in the same place that they were some years ago. I came into a government, for example, that was daily pilloried by the media and took it on the chin as part of the rules of politics, that you were exposed to the media. One could even argue that it was our fair play with the media that enabled the media to bring us down in 2014 by having painted an image of the government that ended up destroying us in many ways with the voters. But nonetheless, you don't see reports of IT raids on newspapers. You don't see reports of editors being fired because of pressure on publishers. You don't see all sorts of kinds of things that have happened in the last 7 years to media. So there's one example. A second example is you're finding journalists arrested on sedition charges and they're going off to cover a rape story. In one case, a journalist is in jail for a year without any actual trial having taken place. We have had a comedian locked up in preventive detention for a joke he hadn't cracked. So you've got extraordinary things happening. You've got campuses being shut down, student protests leading to sedition charges, a tank being parked on a university campus. You've had people's civil liberties seriously questioned day in and day out. You've actually had sedition charges being filed even against members of parliament. I am one of them, so I can tell you that these are the kinds of things we've had to face. what are we going in for? Why are we doing this to our democracy? What kind of country do we want to be? Very clearly, the present rulers of this country have a very different idea of what to them is acceptable discourse from what the previous government of this country had. We had a much more chalne do kind of thing, attitude, that this is a country where all sorts, the perennial blooming of 1,000 flowers. Whereas with this lot, there is a tightness of control, a stifling of expression, a limitation on what is acceptable, a delegitimization of dissent as anti-national, all of this happening. And therefore, the premises from which government officials and ministers are approaching issues is fundamentally different. I cannot imagine that when the previous governments were in office, they would have instructed secretaries to the government not to show up to a parliamentary committee meeting. That would have been seen as an act of blatant contempt of parliamentary democracy. I cannot imagine a government refusing to even discuss a matter of legitimate worldwide concern in the so-called temple of democracy. Given all of these things, I have to ask you, how do you expect, and we will continue obviously working with the systems we have. I always speak, especially when I'm abroad, of our government and our prime minister and so on. But do they see us engaged with them in a common cause of creating a better India? Or do they see us with instinctive hostility and suspicion as people whom they need to thwart, subvert, and undermine at every point? Every indication in the last few years has been of the latter. And whereas for previous governments, the opposition were partners in the striving to somehow make our way to improving the lot of life of millions of Indians, there is no sense of partnership between the present government and its opposition. There is nothing but unbridled hostility. And to my mind, that is a very, very sad thing for our democracy.
Thank you very much, Shashi. And
thank you, Shoma.